For 300 years, this fruit has killed anyone who took a bite. The nobility passed it from hand to hand at feasts like a poisoned chalice and laughed. No one dared. But a ragged vagabond stepped across the hall and took death from a silver platter. But let's rewind an hour. He opens his eyes and doesn't know where he is. His body aches as if he'd been run through a threshing machine. The hands are not his own. Thin, dirty, with crusts of dried earth in the cracks. He lies on a stone floor in some corner, and the air reeks of sour sweat and rancid grease. Other ragged figures are swarming nearby. Someone is moaning. Someone is gnawing at a crust of bread as if it were the last meal of his life. Timofey sits up, and the world swims before his eyes. Hunger. A hunger he has never known before. Not the kind he felt when he skipped lunch, but the kind where the body begins to eat itself. His stomach has clenched into a fist and is pounding from within. He looks at his hands again. These aren't his hands. His used to be wider, calloused from the shovel and pruning shears, with caked-on dirt that no soap could wash away. But these belong to someone who had long since stopped working. He tries to remember. The road. Night. The headlights of an oncoming car blurred into a streak of light. The steering wheel jerked. And that was it. Timofey Yassinev, 31 years old, agronomist and plant breeder. Dead. Apparently dead, because this is definitely not a hospital, and definitely not a morgue. It's something else entirely. A fat man in a greasy apron kicks him in the side. Want to eat? Get up and go to the hall. There's a feast going on. Must be a party. They need hands to haul leftovers and scrub the floors. For that, they'll give him a bowl of soup. Timofey gets up. His legs won't obey him. His knees are shaking. But hunger would get a dead man up. He staggers after the fat man through a narrow corridor. Stone walls. Torches in iron holders. The ceiling is so low he has to duck his head. The corridor ends and Timofey steps into the hall. And he freezes. Columns of gray stone rise upward and fade into the twilight. Long tables are groaning under the weight of food. Meat, bread, fruit, pitchers of wine. The smell hits his nose and his hunger howls so loudly he nearly falls. The nobility sits at the tables, expensive fabrics, gold on their fingers and necks, faces that are well-fed and bored. They laugh. They eat not because they are hungry, but because they can. Timofey stands by the far column with a rag in his hands, soaking it up. He doesn't know the language. But after a couple of minutes, something clicks in his head, and the words take on meaning. As if someone were slowly turning the dial on a radio. First, fragments, then, whole sentences. One nobleman complains to another about the drought. The fields have failed for the 3rd year. The wells are drying up. Manna is draining from the earth like water through a sieve. Manna. The word echoes over and over. Timofey doesn't know what it is, but from the way these people say it, he understands. Manna here is the same as water in a dry year. It's the same as oil. It's the same as oxygen. Without it, everything dies. And there isn't enough of it. The kingdom is called Vellastir, and it is dying. The land here hasn't yielded a harvest in a long time. People survive on imported manna, which they buy from their wealthy neighbors with their last gold. The feast was not held out of joy. A delegation from the Manna Guild has arrived. They brought a new shipment, and terms along with it. Timofey doesn't understand what they are, but he can tell by the faces of the nobility. The terms were like a knife to the throat. And then something happens that changes everything. Servants carry in a silver platter, large, heavy, covered with a silk cloth. The hall falls silent. The cloth is removed, and on the platter lies a fruit, dark, about the size of 2 fists. The skin is oily and thick. It looks like a pear, but is larger, and something is emanating from it. The air around the fruit shimmers, like over scorching asphalt in the heat. The hall buzzes. A nobleman stands and gives a speech. Timofey picks up on the main point. The cursed fruit. The last seed of the tree of the world. Anyone who takes a bite will burn from the inside in a minute. It has been served at feasts for 300 years. It is a tradition. It is a test. It is entertainment for those who can laugh at death. The dish makes its way around the table. Each nobleman takes the fruit in his hands. He pretends to be thinking, shakes his head with a fake smile and passes it on. The ladies gasp. The men crack jokes. The fruit makes its way around the table like a poisoned chalice at a masquerade. No one intends to eat it. But Timofey looks at the fruit and stops hearing the room. Because the agronomist's eyes see what no one else here sees. The skin is slimy and dense. It is neither a disease nor a curse. It is a waxy coating. This is how the plant protects the ripe fruit from moisture loss. The turgor is perfect. The tissues are saturated to the limit. Not a spot of rot, not a dent. This fruit hasn't been sitting on a platter for 300 years. It has ripened. It has ripened for 300 years and reached the absolute peak of ripeness, a level that no fruit on earth has ever reached in the entire history of breeding. Timofey swallows hard. Hunger strikes like a sledgehammer, and before him lies the most perfect fruit he has ever seen in both of his lives. The platter completes the circle. The nobles have finished laughing. A servant reaches to take it from the table, and then Timofey takes a step, then another. He walks across the hall, and the ragged figures by the walls flinch. The nobility is stunned. A guard twitches but is too late. Timofey takes the fruit from the platter, heavy, warm. Something is pulsing inside, like a heartbeat. The hall is silent. 100 eyes are fixed on the ragged man holding death in his hands. He brings the fruit to his face. The skin smells of a storm and wet bark. That's how the earth smells in spring when life is about to burst forth from it. He takes a bite. The taste crashes down like an avalanche. Pear, oak, storm, honey, damp soil, rotting leaves, all at once. Everything he knew about life and growth was crammed into a single swallow. And then the fire comes. Energy lashes his body in a searing stream. It burns his veins, it twists his joints, it creeps into every cell and tears it apart from the inside. Timofey falls to his knees. His mouth opens in a silent scream. The guards jump to their feet. Someone shouts that he's about to burn up. Someone runs. The guards raise their spears, not knowing who to aim at. The fire bursts outward. Another second, and it will blow Timofey apart like an overheated boiler. And that's when the agronomist kicks in. Not a mage, not a hero, not the chosen one, an agronomist. Energy is a flow. The flow must be distributed, not fought, directed, like water through canals, like nutrient solution through a drip system. Not all to one point, evenly, throughout the entire volume. He closes his eyes and imagines himself not as a man but as a field, the soil horizon, the root system, the capillary network. Mana is not fire. Mana is nourishment, and nourishment must be distributed. Roots don't take just anything from the soil. They filter. They take what's needed and how much is needed. Timofey begins to filter. The fire doesn't, but it stops tearing his body apart. It flows, slowly, down his arms, down his legs, down his spine, like warm water through irrigation channels. Timofey opens his eyes. The world has changed. He sees. No, he feels. The stone floor beneath his knees, dead, not a drop of life. The walls, stone from a quarry where not a single root remains. The air is dry, dried up, but in the cracks between the slabs, there, tiny spores, seeds, carried by the wind years ago. They are waiting. They are alive. They simply lack the strength to sprout. Timofey stands up. His legs hold him. His body no longer hurts. The hunger hasn't gone anywhere, but now something else has mixed in with it. Strength. Quiet. Steady. Like a hum in the roots of a great tree. The hall stares at him in deathly silence. The outcast ate the forbidden fruit and did not burn. He stands. He breathes. He looks. Timofey scans the hall with his gaze. He is searching for one face. He finds it, at the head table. A young woman, almost a girl. But her eyes are 10 years older than her face. A thin silver headband on her head. A princess. She isn't screaming. She isn't running. She sits and stares at him without looking away. Not with fear, with something else. Timofey raises his hand. Not for a gesture, not for magic. He simply looks at his palm. It glows. Thin green lines run beneath the skin, like the veins of a leaf. Like a map of rivers on a satellite image. He clenches his fist. The lines fade. He unclenches it. They flare up again. The hall buzzes. Someone falls to their knees. Someone curses. The guards back away. And Timofey stands in the midst of this chaos and thinks of one thing. His hunger hasn't gone anywhere. And now he wants to eat twice as much. The morning began with the clanking of chains. Timofey was thrown into the palace basement immediately after the feast. 2 guards twisted his arms behind his back and dragged him down the stairs. He didn't resist. Not because he couldn't, but because he saw no point. Where could he run in a foreign world, in a foreign body, without food and without knowing where he was? The cell was small. A stone sack 2 by 3 paces. The straw on the floor had rotted into black slime. It smelled of urine and dampness. Timofey sat down in a corner and leaned against the wall. Cold stone. Dead. Not a single living organism within 5 centimeters of thickness. He could feel it now, after the fetus. He could feel life and death around him like a temperature. The stone was dead. The straw was dead. The air was almost dead. But somewhere above, behind the ceiling, about 3 meters up, roots, thin as threads. Some weed had pushed its way between the courtyard slabs and sent roots downward. Timofey closed his eyes and reached for those roots. Not with his hand, with something new. That power that had spread through his body after the fruit. He touched the roots and they responded. Like a string. A quiet ring ran through his body. And Timofey saw. No, felt. The soil above, its composition, its pain. Salt on the surface in a thick crust. A dead horizon 1.5 meters deep. And below, beneath the dead layer, old water. Not a stream, an aquifer. About 5 meters down. It had always been there. 300 years. There was just no one to reach it. He was so engrossed that he didn't notice the night had passed. The creak of a door woke him. 3 men had arrived. A guard, a priest in white robes with a tree embroidered in gold on his chest, and one more man, short, stout, with a gentle face and attentive eyes, dressed expensively but without ostentation. The priest spoke first. He said that the ragged man had committed sacrilege, the cursed fruit, a sacred relic of the temple of the tree. Its desecration is punishable by death. The execution is scheduled for noon, public, in the palace square. Timofey listened calmly, not because he wasn't afraid. He was afraid. But in his 31 years of life, he had grown accustomed to the fact that panic doesn't help. Not when the plot was burning. Not when his dissertation was rejected for the 3rd time. Not when the grant didn't come through and he had nothing to eat. Panic is a luxury, and he had always been too busy to afford it. The portly man remained silent and watched. Then the priest left, and the portly man stayed. He introduced himself. His name was Kasser, master of the Manna Guild, the very representative of the delegation for whom the feast had been held. He spoke softly and slowly, like a doctor with a difficult patient. He said that for the first time in 300 years, someone had survived the fetus. That's interesting. That's very interesting. The guild would like to study this phenomenon. He could try to get the execution commuted, in exchange for cooperation. Timofey asked what kind of cooperation. Kasser smiled and replied that, to start with, just simple tests, to measure mana levels, to understand the mechanism of survival. And then, we'll see. Timofey looked into his eyes, gentle, intelligent, patient. The eyes of a man accustomed to getting what he wants not by force, but through patience. Timofey had seen such eyes before, on land speculators, on those who arrived at failing farms with a friendly smile and a contract in their briefcase. He said he would think it over. Kassar nodded. He said he had until noon, and he left. Timofey was left alone. He thought. Not about the execution, not about Kassar, about water, about the aquifer 5 meters beneath the palace square, about the dead land that wasn't cursed. It was simply forgotten. An hour later they came for him. 4 guards, chains on his hands, chains on his feet. They led him upstairs, corridors, stairs. The light hit his eyes when they pushed him out onto the square. The palace square of Vellastir. Large, stone and packed earth. Not a single tree, not a single bush, not a single blade of grass. The square was as dead as the surface of the moon. A crowd had gathered around. Common folk, gaunt faces, sunken eyes, clothes patched 10 times over. They had come to watch the execution. Entertainment. The only free entertainment in a dying city. On a platform at the far edge of the square stood the princess, Vellastir. Timothy recognized her. The very one. A silver hoop. Eyes older than her face. A priest stood beside her. Beside the priest, the executioner. Large, indifferent, with an axe. Timofey was led to the center of the square. The priest began to read the sentence. At length, solemnly. Timofey wasn't listening. He was looking down, at the ground, at the compacted, caked crust beneath his feet. And he could feel everything. Salt, heavy metals in the top layer, a destroyed structure. Not a single living microorganism within a 10-meter radius. But deeper, 5 meters. Water, old, pure, patient, waiting. And even deeper, 8 meters. Remnants of roots, ancient, mighty, dead but not decayed, like the skeleton of something enormous. He understood. A tree had once grown here. Not just a tree, something so large that its root system permeated the entire area, and when it perished, the earth died with it. The priest finished reading. The executioner raised his axe. The crowd fell silent. And then, Timofey dropped to one knee. Not out of fear, not out of supplication. He placed his palm on the ground, on the baked, hard, dead crust, and closed his eyes. He reached downward, through the dead horizon, through the salt, through the stone, toward the water, and toward those dead roots. He wasn't casting a spell. He was doing what he'd done his whole life, making a diagnosis. This land lacked water. It lacked organic matter. It lacked microflora. But all of it was right there, right beneath it. It just needed to be connected. Mana flowed from him into the earth. Green lines on his hands flared up and ran down his skin toward his fingers. The earth beneath his palm trembled. The crowd gasped. The guards stepped back. The executioner froze with his axe raised. A crack spread from his hand. Not destructive, alive. The earth opened as a bud opens in spring, and a sprout emerged from the crack. Pale, thin, trembling, like a newborn. It stretched upward, slowly, then faster. The stem thickened, hardened. Branches appeared, leaves unfurled one after another. In the space of 10 heartbeats, a small tree twice a man's height stood in the dead square. A young ash tree, with white flowers. They all bloomed at once, and the air filled with fragrance. Timofey knew that scent. That is how the earth smells after the first rain. That is how life smells when it returns. The square was silent. Timofey stood up. His legs were shaking. His head was buzzing. Hunger surged from within with such force that he staggered. Mana. He had spent a lot. His body demanded replenishment. He could sense the people around him. Dozens, hundreds. There was life in each of them. Warm, flowing, accessible. He could reach out and take it. Just take it. A little. From each one. They wouldn't even notice. Or maybe they would. Timofey clenched his teeth. No. His hands clenched into fists. Green lines on his skin pulsed. He suppressed the hunger, just as he had suppressed the panic, through sheer willpower. Princess Erin stood on the platform and looked at the tree, then at him, then back at the tree. The priest beside her opened his mouth and couldn't close it. The executioner lowered his axe. Timofey looked at the princess and spoke. He said there was no curse here. It was simply that no one had thought to ask the earth what it lacked. Water, 5 meters down. Old roots, 8 meters down. The mycorrhiza is destroyed, but the spores have survived in the deeper layers. This area could have been revived 10 years ago, 20, 100. It was waiting. He paused. Then he added, "They can execute him if they want, but let them first look at what has been lying under their feet all this time. For nothing." The silence was so thick you could hear the leaves of a young ash tree rustling. The first rustling of leaves in this area in 300 years. Erin raised her hand. "The execution is cancelled." He wasn't released. He was moved. From the basement cell to a room on the second floor of the palace wing. Small. A bed. A table. A jug of water. The window barred with a grill. Not a prison, but not freedom either. A happy medium for someone they hadn't yet decided to consider a miracle or a threat. The first thing Timofey did was drink the entire jug. Then he lay down on the bed. His body ached, not from the beatings, from hunger. That new hunger that had come along with the power. Ordinary hunger pounded at the stomach. This one pounded throughout his entire body. Every cell begged to eat, begged for manna. He lay there and learned. He closed his eyes and listened. After the fruit, the power worked like a new sense. He felt the life around him. Behind the wall to the right. Ivy on the palace's outer wall. Old, tenacious, half dead but stubborn. Its roots went into the cracks between the stones and drew out crumbs of moisture. Behind the wall to the left, a man, a guard at the door. Timofey could feel his breath, his warmth, his life. And hunger whispered that he could reach out, that the man wouldn't notice, that it wouldn't hurt him at all. Timofey opened his eyes and sat up. No, he stood and walked to the window. Beyond the bars was a courtyard, dead, like everything else here. Stone, dust, packed earth. And in the middle of the courtyard stood his ash tree, the very same one, from the square. From here, Timofey could see its top. The white flowers hadn't fallen yet. People stood around the tree, just standing and watching. Some were touching the trunk. An old woman sat on the ground next to the roots and stroked the bark as if it were a living creature. Timofey turned away from the window. They brought him food an hour later. Bread, cheese, liquid porridge, meat. He ate it all in 3 minutes and asked for more. They brought more. He ate it. He asked for more. The maid who carried the trays looked at him in horror. He ate 5 servings and his hunger subsided. Ordinary hunger, the kind in your stomach. Another kind of hunger, the one in every cell. It remained, steady, lingering, like a chronic pain you get used to but never forget. Toward evening, the princess came, alone, without guards. She entered and stood by the door. Timofey was sitting on the bed. They looked at each other. She was young, 22 years old, but her back was straight. Her shoulders were squared. Her chin was lifted. That's how people stand who've had too much placed on them too early. She asked who he was. Timofey replied that he was an agronomist. She didn't understand. He said he was a man who taught plants to grow where they couldn't grow. She asked where he was from. He paused. Then he said he was from far away, very far away. She asked how he'd done it. The tree in the square. Timofey began to explain. He talked about the aquifer, about the soil's dead zone, about the salt crust, about mycorrhizal spores in the deep layers. He spoke the way he was used to speaking during his dissertation defense, clearly, point by point, using technical terms. She didn't understand half the words, he could tell. He paused, thought, started over, more simply. He said that the land beneath Vellastir isn't cursed. It's sick, like a sick person. It lacks water. It lacks life in the soil. It lacks those tiny creatures that make the earth alive. All of this can be restored, not by magic, not by prayer, by work, by knowledge. by understanding exactly what this particular land needs. The princess listened. She asked a question Timofey hadn't expected. She asked how much, not how, not why, how much he could revive, how much land, in what time. Timofey estimated, quickly, just as he had estimated the areas of the experimental plots, alone, without help, with the mana he currently had. A small plot, a hectare, maybe 2, per day. But if he had helpers, if there were people who knew how to work the land, if they showed him a soil map, if they gave him time to study the local conditions, he could teach others, not everything, but the basics. He could create a system. The princess was silent for a long time. Then she said one thing. She said that Vellastir buys mana from the guild. For the last 20 years, the kingdom has been mortgaging lands and titles to pay for the supplies. In 6 months, there will be nothing left to mortgage. In a year without mana, a famine will begin. A real one. Not like the one now, a mass one. She said this in an even voice, without a tremor, like a report, like someone who had long since crunched the numbers and knew that numbers don't lie. Timofey nodded. He understood. She doesn't believe in miracles. She's looking for a resource. He is a resource. That's fair. He asked what she was proposing. She made a simple offer. He works for Vellastir. He revives the land. He teaches people. In return, he receives freedom, food, protection, the status of royal advisor on land affairs. Timofey almost laughed. Advisor on land affairs. A PhD had landed a position in another world. He agreed. But he set a condition. He needed land. Not a patch, a plot. For experiments, for breeding, to understand how mana interacts with the soil and plants. He needs soil samples from all over Vellastir. He needed access to water. And he needed someone who knew the local plants. A reference guide, a catalog, a living person who could show what grows here and what used to grow here. The princess said she would arrange it. She stood up, walked to the door, stopped, turned around, and said that the tree in the square was still standing. People are carrying water to it. Old people are crying. Children are hanging ribbons on the branches. For the first time in 20 years, she saw people in the city smiling. She said this in the same even voice, but Timofey noticed. For a split second, her hands clenched, her knuckles turned white. Then they relaxed. She left. Timofey went back to the window. The ash tree stood there. White flowers glowed in the twilight. Candles burned around it. Dozens of candles. People had brought candles to the tree, as if to a temple. Timofey thought the tree would outlive them all. He had given it the right root architecture. A deep taproot down to the water table. A branched surface network to collect moisture. The mycorrhiza he had restored would bind the tree to the soil into a single system. In a year it would produce seeds. In 5 years there would be a grove around it, if they gave him 5 years. He lay down on the bed, closed his eyes. Hunger hummed in his body with a steady drone. Tomorrow the work would begin, the real work. The work for which he had lived 31 years, and for which he had apparently died. He fell asleep and dreamed of roots, huge ones, as thick as a house. They entwined the whole world, and they were dead. But in the very depths, in the very center, something was beating. Quietly, stubbornly, like a heart. The next morning, Timofey was given clean clothes, simple but intact. A shirt, pants, boots. For the first time since he'd been in this world, he felt like a human being and not a sack of bones. They led him to the palace garden, what was called a garden. Timofey stood in the middle of it and said nothing. It was a wasteland the size of 2 football fields, fenced in by a stone wall. Trees had once grown here. He saw stumps, dozens of stumps, cut down and uprooted. The earth between them was cracked and sunken, gray, dead. Not a single blade of grass. The palace gardener stood nearby, an old man with trembling hands and dull eyes. He said the trees had been cut down 15 years ago. They had stopped bearing fruit. The manna had left the earth and the roots had dried up. Nothing has grown here since. Every year they plant new seeds. Nothing sprouts. Timofey dropped to one knee and placed his palm on the ground. He closed his eyes. Green lines flashed across his skin and he dove into the soil. Analysis. Just as he had done hundreds of times in the experimental fields. Only now, instead of instruments and laboratories, he had his hands and manna. The topsoil, 10 centimeters, dead, completely. No bacteria, no fungi, no protozoa. A crust of salts and clay baked into stone. Zero water permeability. Rain, if it ever falls here, rolls off the surface without being absorbed. Second horizon, 10 to 40 centimeters. Compacted. Traces of an old root system, channels from rotted roots. Empty. The structure is destroyed. But there is organic matter here. Dead. Humus from those very trees that once grew here. It hasn't gone anywhere. There's just no one to process it. Deeper. A meter and a half. Moisture. Not an aquifer like in the square, but simply residual moisture. Sufficient. And more. Manna. Weak. Scattered. Like the last warmth in a cooling stove. But it's there. Timofey opened his eyes, stood up, looked at the gardener, and said he needed manure. The gardener blinked. Manure. Lots of manure. Cow manure, horse manure, chicken manure, any kind. The more variety, the better. He also needed ash, wood ash, and clay. Red clay, if available, and straw. Lots of straw. The gardener looked at him as if Timofey had spoken in a dead language. He asked again. Manure. Timofey confirmed. Manure. Not mana, not magic crystals, not sacred relics. Manure. 3 hours later, they brought him 3 carts. He got to work. He marked out a plot. Not the whole garden, just one 10 by 10 meter patch. You have to start small, with a controlled experiment. Timofey worked with his hands. He broke up the crust with a shovel. He mixed the manure with ash and clay. He formed the beds. He laid down straw as mulch. The guards watched from behind the wall. The gardener stood nearby and said nothing. Palace servants peered over the wall. The great man who grew a tree from stone, who had survived the cursed fruit, who had forced the princess to cancel the execution, kneeling in manure. Timofey paid no attention. He worked. And while his hands worked, his mind worked separately. He thought about manna, about how it was connected to life in the soil. In the square, he had acted intuitively. He had poured manna into the ground and forced a sprout to break through. Crudely, inefficiently, like flooding a field with water from a hose instead of drip irrigation. 90% of the manna had gone to waste. He needed to be more precise. He needed to understand the system. He finished preparing the plot by noon. His hands were black up to his elbows. His back was aching. Ordinary human fatigue. Pleasant. Familiar. Timofey straightened up and saw a girl standing at the garden gate. Young, a head shorter than him. Red hair pulled back in a ponytail. A face covered in freckles. Simple clothes. Work clothes. A leather bag on her belt, from which bundles of dried herbs stuck out. She looked at him with an expression he classified as fierce curiosity. She said her name was Liz, Elizabeth Kahn, that she was an alchemist, that she'd been told a man had appeared at the palace who'd grown a tree from a stone. She said it was impossible and that she'd come to see for herself. Timofey pointed to the plot and asked if she knew what composting was. Liz opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said she had come to see a miracle, not a pile of manure. Timofey replied that the pile of manure was the miracle, just a slow one. Liz stayed. She sat on a rock by the wall and watched him work. She asked questions, lots of questions. Why manure? Why the ash? Why red clay and not white? What is mycorrhiza? Why does he mix in straw instead of burning it? Timofey answered. And the more he answered, the more he realized that this girl wasn't just curious. She was catching on. Quickly. Precisely. She was translating his explanations into the local language of alchemy and drawing parallels. When he explained the principle of composting, she said it was like the fermentation of potions. Timofey paused. He looked at her, and for the first time in 2 days in this world, he smiled. She was right. Fermentation and composting. Different names for the same principle, breaking down the complex into the simple to create a nutrient-rich environment for new growth. By evening, the plot was ready. Timofey stood before it, gathering his thoughts. Now, he would do what he hadn't done correctly yesterday in the square. He crouched down, placed his hands on the prepared soil. He closed his eyes. And he didn't start with manna. He started with analysis. What's there? What's needed? Manure provided organic matter and nitrogen. Ash provided potassium and phosphorus. Clay improved the structure. Straw created a framework to retain moisture. Now, life was needed. Microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, those who would turn dead organic matter into living soil. Timofey reached down with his manna, gently, not in a stream, but in threads. He searched and found, at a depth of 1.5 meters, spores, ancient, dormant, waiting, remnants of the microflora that lived here when the garden was still a garden. He touched them with manna, gently, like lighting a match, not a fire, but a spark. The spores stirred, came to life, began to divide. Timofey guided them, upward, toward the manure, toward the organic matter, toward food. It was like drip irrigation, precise, targeted. Every thread of manna went where it was needed and carried exactly as much energy as was required, no more. The plot stirred, not literally, but Timofey could feel the process beginning inside the soil. The microorganisms had awakened and pounced on the organic matter. The soil temperature rose. Moisture appeared on the surface. Liz gasped behind him. Timofey didn't stop. He waited. Another minute. 2. The soil's structure was changing. From a dead, caked-together mass, it was turning into a living, loose sponge. Dark, moist, smelling of life. Timofey took the seeds out of his pocket. The gardener had given him a handful that morning. A local grain. Spelt. It hadn't grown in Vellastir for 10 years. He placed the seeds on the ground and didn't waste mana on growth. The seeds swelled on their own. A minute later, they sprouted. 5 minutes later, the first leaves emerged. Not from magic, from the fact that they had fallen into the right soil. Living, ready, waiting. Timofey stood up. His head was spinning. Hunger gnawed at him, but it was bearable. He had spent 10 times less mana than yesterday in the square, and the result was better. Because he had worked not against the earth, but with it. Liz stood nearby, looking at the spelt sprouts. Her hands were shaking. She said quietly that she couldn't believe her eyes. Timofey replied that eyes had nothing to do with it. Here, the nose is more important. Let her smell the earth. Liz bent down and sniffed, and her face changed. She said the earth smelled like rain. She said she couldn't remember the last time the earth in Vellastir had smelled like that. Timofey nodded. Earth after rain. Petrichor. The scent of geosmin released by actinomycetes when moistened. The scent of living soil. He didn't say that. He just nodded. Petrichor probably means something good in the local language, too. Liz looked up at him and said she wanted to learn. Not to watch, not to take notes, to learn how to do the same thing. Timofey looked at her. Red hair, freckles. Her eyes were burning. Her hands were in the soil because she had been digging too while he worked. The first person in this world who said, "Don't show me a miracle, teach me." He replied that they would start with soil science theory in the morning. For 4 days, Timofey didn't leave the garden. He slept in the garden beds, literally. Liz brought him food 3 times a day and found him in the same position every time. On his knees, hands in the soil, eyes closed. At first she thought he was meditating. Then she understood. He was listening to the soil, like a doctor listens to a patient through a stethoscope. The plot was transformed. The spelt had grown to the height of a hand and was heading out just like in a textbook. But Timofey wasn't happy. He frowned, because the spelt was wrong. The variety wasn't suited to local conditions. Too much moisture, too little sun. He needed information. He questioned Liz for hours. What crops grow in the neighboring kingdoms? What used to grow in Vellastir? What the average temperature is? How many days a year it rains? How manna behaves in the soil? Liz answered, and asked her own questions. Timofey explained. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, soil acidity, water balance, mycorrhiza, and symbiotic relationships. Liz took notes. She had a thick notebook with a leather cover. By the end of the second day, the notebook was full. She took out a second one. By the end of the fourth day, the second one ran out too. On the third day, another one arrived. Timofey didn't notice her right away. He was kneeling at the far edge of the plot, studying the soil samples laid out in a row. 32 samples from different sections of the palace garden, each in a separate bowl, each labeled. He analyzed them one by one, touched them with his hand, read them with manhwa, recorded the results in the board with charcoal. Liz stood nearby and translated his notes into the local language. And then a quiet voice sounded behind him. Very quiet, almost a whisper. The voice said that the sample in the 14th bowl had been collected incorrectly. The top layer was mixed with the bottom. The result would be inaccurate. Timofey turned around. A girl. Young. 19, maybe 20. Dark hair falling over her face. Eyes downcast. Hands clasped in front of her. She stood 3 steps away and looked as if she were ready to run away at any moment. Liz gasped and said that this was her sister, Mira. She apologized and said that Mira had just come to watch. Mira didn't look up. Timofey looked at the 14th bowl. He took out a sample, rubbed it between his fingers, touched it with manhwa, and saw that the girl was right. The two horizons were mixed. He hadn't noticed it himself. He asked how she'd figured it out. Mira didn't answer. Liz answered for her. She said that's just how Mira is. She sees things. Plants reach out to her. The earth trusts her. But she wasn't a mage, not a druid. She just sensed things. Their father had been an apothecary. He went bankrupt when manna became expensive and the herbs stopped growing. Liz taught herself alchemy. Mira learned to talk to the garden beds, better than she could with people. Mira stood there and said nothing. Her fingers fiddled with the hem of her sleeve. Timofey approached her, not too close. He crouched down to be lower, like one approaches a skittish animal. He held out a bowl with a sample and asked her to show him how to do it right. Mira looked at the bowl, then at him. For the first time, she looked up. Gray eyes, large, with such depth that Timofey forgot for a second that he was 31 and a PhD candidate, not a boy. She took the bowl. She walked to the edge of the plot. She knelt down, and carefully, very carefully, she removed the top centimeter of soil, separately, then the next one, separately, then the next one. 4 layers, each into its own hole. Her hands moved with confidence, not a single wasted motion. That's how people work who've done this 1,000 times. Timofey watched and learned, layer by layer sampling, a basic technique of field soil science. This girl, who was afraid of people and hid behind her hair, had mastered it better than half of his students. He turned to Liz and said he needed both of them. Liz broke into a smile. Mira hunched her shoulders. But she didn't run away. On the 5th day, Timofey was ready for the next step. He stood before the plot and thought. The spelt had grown. Proof of concept achieved. The soil in Vellastir isn't dead, it's sleeping. But spelt doesn't solve the problem. He needs a grain that will survive here without constant feeding with manna. One that would grow on its own, year after year, in poor soil, with little water. He needed a selection. On Earth, that would take years, decades. But here he had manna and knowledge, a combination that no one else in this world possessed. He asked Liz to bring him every seed she could find, Any grains, from any kingdom. Liz left and returned a day later with a sack. Seeds from the palace stores, seeds from the market, seeds she had begged from merchants and stolen from a distracted caravan driver. 12 varieties. Timofey spread them out on a board and began his work. He took each seed, held it in his palm, touched it with manna, and read it like a book. Genetic potential, drought resistance, root system depth, maturation speed, nutrient requirements. He didn't see DNA. He saw the essence, what this plant strives for and what stands in its way. And he could change it, carefully, precisely, like a breeder who, in a single generation, achieves what nature would take 100 to accomplish. For 3 days he worked with the seeds, crossbreeding, selecting, crossbreeding again. Liz recorded every step. Mira sat nearby, holding the seeds in her palms before passing them to him. And Timofey noticed something strange. The seeds that had been in Mira's hands sprouted 2 days faster. He didn't tell her about it. Not yet. On the 8th day he had a result. A new variety. A nameless grain. Similar to wheat but with roots 3 times longer. Drought resistant. Capable of growing in poor soil. Consuming a minimum of manna. Maturing in 40 days instead of the usual 90. Timofey planted it on the plot. Liz and Mira stood nearby. By evening, the grain had grown to knee height. The next morning, it had headed, golden, heavy, real. Timofey plucked an ear, rubbed it in his palms. The grains were large and dense. He tasted one. The flavor was simple, slightly sweet, bread-like. You could bake with this. You could feed people with this. Liz looked at the ear and said nothing. Then she said quietly that this grain must have a name. Timofey thought. He looked at Liz. He looked at Mira, who was sitting on the ground and stroking the sprouts as if they were kittens. He said he would call it Canova spelt, in honor of the 2 sisters without whom he would have found neither the seeds nor the right soil sample. Liz opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her face flushed all the way to the tips of her ears. She said it was silly and that she hadn't done anything special. Then she turned away. But Timofey saw her run her hand over her eyes. Mira lifted her head. For the first time, she looked at him without hiding behind her hair. And she smiled, quietly, like a flower blooming at night when no one is watching. Timofey gathered the grains, 10 ears of wheat. That would be enough for a plot 10 times larger. And that plot would be enough for a field. And that field would be enough for Vellastir. That evening he went to see the princess. He brought an ear of grain. He placed it on the table in front of her. And he told her that in 3 months, Vellastir could harvest its first crop, not bought with manna, their own bread from their own land. The princess took the ear of grain. She turned it over in her hands. She sniffed it, rubbed the grain between her fingers. She tasted it, and remained silent for a long time. Then she asked if this would be enough for Vellastir to stop buying manna from the guild. Timofey honestly replied that he didn't know. Grain is only the beginning. The land needs more. Trees, shrubs, grasses, the entire ecosystem. A living chain in which every link supports the next. You can't revive a country with just grain, but grain is the first step, and it works. The princess put the ear of grain in a drawer in her desk, carefully, the way one puts away jewels. And she said that tomorrow it would be taken to the nearest village, Recold, a 2-hour ride from the capital. The village is dying. The wells have dried up. People are leaving. If he can do for the village what he did for the garden plot, she will believe him, and not just her. Timofey nodded. 1 garden bed in the yard is an experiment. 1 village is proof. He returned to the garden. Liz was sitting by the plot, rereading her notes by candlelight. Mira was sleeping curled up between the beds. The cereal sprouts leaned toward her, reaching out, as if they wanted to cover her. Timofey sat down beside her. Hunger rumbled in his body as a familiar background noise. But today, it was quieter than usual. Perhaps because Timofey finally felt something he hadn't felt since waking up in this world. Direction. He knew where to go. He knew what to do. In 3 months, Vellastir would harvest his first crop. If they gave him 3 months. The road to Recold took 3 hours, not 2, as promised. The horse beneath Timofey could barely drag itself along. He didn't know how to ride, neither in this life nor in the last. His butt was already aching after half an hour. An hour later, he seriously thought he'd prefer execution. Liz rode alongside and didn't miss a chance to point this out. She said that a great magician gardener who revives dead earth couldn't handle a single horse. Timofey replied that horses weren't his area of expertise. Mira rode behind and said nothing. She held a bag of horsetail seeds close to her chest and looked around. 2 guards brought up the rear of the column. The princess had sent them as an escort, or as overseers. Timofey couldn't tell. The landscape beyond the city walls struck him harder than anything he had seen in recent days. The capital of Vellastir was dying quietly, beyond the walls, imperceptibly. Here, the dying was laid bare. The road ran across the plain, brown, cracked. Not a single tree as far as the eye could see. The earth lay in layers like torn skin. Cracks a finger's width wide crisscrossed the surface into uneven squares. Timofey did not dismount. He did not need to touch this earth to make a diagnosis. He could sense it from a distance. The manna here had not simply dried up. It had been sucked out, purposefully, methodically, layer by layer. That doesn't happen from drought. Drought kills from the top down. Here, it had been killed from the bottom up. The deep layers had been drained dry. The surface layers simply withered away afterward because they were left without nourishment. Someone had been drawing manna from this land like oil from a well, for a long time, systematically. Timofey put that thought aside for later. Recold appeared from behind the hill like a wound. 24 houses, stone walls, shingle roofs. Half the roofs had caved in. A quarter of the houses were empty. Timofey realized this from the lack of smoke coming from the chimneys. People had left. Those who had nowhere to go remained. They were met by the village elder, a man of about 50 with a face that looked 70, gaunt, tanned by the sun. His hands were large and empty, the hands of a man who was used to working but who had nothing left to do. He looked at Timofey, at the guards, at the sack of seeds, and there was no hope in his eyes, only polite patience. He was used to visits. People had come from the capital before. They made promises. They took stock. They shook their heads. They left. Nothing changed. He showed them around the village. Timofey watched and listened. 3 wells, all dry. The last one dried up 2 years ago. They haul water from the river 8 kilometers away. The fields haven't yielded a crop for 5 years. The livestock had died out except for 3 goats grazing on dry grass along the roadsides. The population used to be 200 people. 63 remain. Timofey stopped in the middle of the village square. Small, trampled. A well stood in the center. Stone masonry. A wooden gate. A rope was wrapped around the axle and had dried out until it was brittle. He walked up to the well and placed his hand on the stone. He closed his eyes. He reached down. The well was deep, 12 meters. The walls were dry. At the bottom, sand and clay, not a drop of water. But Timofey sensed something else. The well hadn't simply dried up. The aquifer beneath it was alive. There was water, 20 meters down. It had sunk down when the manna dried up. The manna kept the groundwater closer to the surface like an invisible pump. When the pump died, the water sank to where gravity pulled it. That was all. Not a curse. Physics. Hydrology. Timofey opened his eyes. He turned to the village elder and said that there was water here, 20 meters down. They needed to deepen the well or dig a new one. The elder looked at him long and hard and replied that they'd already been told that. 3 years ago, a mage from the guild had come. He'd said the same thing, that the water was deep. He'd offered to pump it up using manna. The price was so high that the village would have had to give up all its remaining land. Forever. They refused. The mage left. The water remained underground. Timofey clenched his teeth. He was beginning to understand the system. The guild wasn't just trading in manna. It controlled access to life. The village could be saved, but only if it gave up everything. And by giving up everything, it would cease to be a village and become property. He asked the village head if there were people in the village who had previously worked the land. The village head smiled wryly and said, "Everyone. Everyone here had worked the land, their whole lives. Only the land no longer worked with them." By evening, Timofey had gathered them together. 23 people, men and women, young and old. They stood in a semicircle and looked at him with the same expression as the village elder. Polite patience. He didn't make any speeches. He took off his shirt. He picked up a shovel and went to dig. He dug until dark, deepening the well. Liz worked beside him, hauling out buckets of earth. Mira sat at the edge, sifting through the dug-up soil with her hands, sorting it, stones separately, clay separately, sand separately. No one asked her to. She just did it. The villagers watched. At first from a distance, then closer. By sunset, 3 men silently took shovels and climbed down into the well. Timofey didn't thank them. He nodded and carried on. At night, he sat by the fire. Hunger gnawed at him, more than usual. Physical labor burned through the energy he already had so little of. Mana replenished slowly. He drew it from the air, from the earth, from everything around him. But there was almost nothing around here. The dead earth yielded only crumbs. Liz sat across from him and wrote in a notebook. Mira was sleeping on her shoulder. Timofey stared at the fire and thought. Tomorrow, he had to get to the water. 20 meters was deep. He couldn't manage it with a shovel in a single day. He'd have to use mana to help, to break through the rock. It would take strength. He looked at the people sleeping around the fire, the villagers. Life glowed within each of them. Mana, small, dim, but alive. Hunger whispered that he could take just a tiny bit, a drop from each. They wouldn't notice. No one would be harmed. Timofey closed his eyes and clenched his fists. No. He stood up and walked away from the fire. He sat in the darkness by the wall of the dead house, and sat there until dawn, controlling his hunger, holding himself back, like holding a fire in a stove, not letting it go out, not letting it break free. They found water on the second day. Timofey stood at the bottom of the well, waist-deep in the pit, and felt the rock beneath his feet change. Sandstone gave way to clay. The clay grew damp, then wet. Then a trickle burst from the wall, thin, murky, but alive. Timofey placed his palm on the wet clay and drew it in with his mana. Carefully. Don't tear it. Don't blow it up. Widen the channel, like turning on a faucet, slowly. The trickle became a stream. The stream became a torrent. Cold, clear water gushed into the well, and Timofey barely managed to get out. Liz pulled him out by the hand. Mira stood at the edge and looked down. The water rose, slowly, centimeter by centimeter. By noon, the well was 1/3 full. Enough. More than enough. The village elder stood nearby and said nothing. He was silent for a long time. Then he walked over to the well. He lowered the bucket. He pulled it up. He brought it to his face. He sniffed it. He tasted it. And his face. The face of a 50-year-old man aged 20 years by drought and despair. It broke. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply sat down on the ground next to the well and bowed his head. His shoulders shook. The bucket stood nearby, full of clean water. A woman came out of the nearest house. She saw. She gasped. She ran to the well. A second woman followed her. A third. 10 minutes later, the whole village was standing by the well. 63 people stared at the water as if it were a dead man returned to life. Children stuck their hands in the bucket and laughed. The old people touched the wet masonry and couldn't believe their fingers. Timofey stood to the side and fought the dizziness. Mana spent. A lot. Hunger clenched his ribs, but he held on. He restored the other 2 wells over the next 2 days. The principle was the same. Dig deeper. Clear it out. Bring the water to the surface. Cheaper each time. More precise each time. He was learning to conserve mana. The first well cost him a third of his supply, the second a fifth, the third a tenth. Understanding worked better than brute force. Now the fields. Timofey walked out of the village and stood at the edge of a barren field. It stretched to the horizon, brown, cracked, monotonous, dead. He dropped to one knee and placed his hands on the ground and began to read. The field told him everything. Once, barley grew here, then wheat, then barley again, then nothing. The earth remembered every crop, every root left a trace, like an imprint in the rock. Timofey read the history of this field over 100 years and saw the mistake. Monoculture. Year after year, the same thing. No crop rotation, no green manure, no rest. The land was wrung out like a rag, and when the manna began to fade and the land weakened, the monoculture finished it off for good. No dead god was needed here, and no great curse was necessary. Human ignorance multiplied by greed was enough. Timofey stood up and walked toward the village. He gathered the people again and began to speak. Not as a mage, not as a messenger of the crown, as an agronomist. He explained what crop rotation is, why you can't get the same crop in the same spot, what green manure is and why it's needed, how legumes fix nitrogen in the soil, why the field needs to rest. People listened. Not everyone understood, but the village elder nodded, and so did the thin woman in the third row with intelligent, weary eyes. Timofey took note of her. Later, work comes first. He divided the barren field into 3 sections. He planted Canova spelt in the first. That's the foundation. Bread, food. The result people will see in 40 days. He set aside the second section for legumes. Liz found a stash of old lentil seeds in the village. God knows how many years they'd been sitting in that sack. But the seeds are resilient. Timofey checked them with manna. Half are dead, half are dormant. That's enough. He left the third section fallow, but not empty. He sowed it with a mixture of herbs he'd thrown together on the fly from what he found along the roadsides and on the cliffs. Wild grasses, clover, something resembled alfalfa, green manure. They won't yield a harvest. They'll give life to the soil. The roots will break up the crust. The green mass will serve as mulch. Microorganisms will get food and multiply. In a season, this land will be ready to bear fruit. He applied the manna precisely, not into the plants, into the soil. He awakened dormant microorganisms. He restored the mycorrhiza. He set the cycle in motion. The plants would manage on their own from there. He just needed to start the engine. After that, the engine would run on its own fuel. 3 days. For 3 days, he worked in the field from dawn until dark. Liz worked alongside him. She wasn't just taking notes anymore. She was doing, mixing compost. She prepared soil inoculants according to his recipes. She argued about the proportions. Once, she turned out to be right. Timofey admitted it without hesitation. She blushed and was silent for 2 hours, which was something incredible for Liz. Mira worked quietly. She walked through the field and adjusted the seedlings with her hands. Wherever she touched the ground, the sprouts emerged half a day earlier. Timofey measured. He recorded. He didn't speak. It wasn't time yet. On the 4th day, guests arrived in the village, 5 of them, dressed in white, with wooden staffs, women, all 5. The oldest looked to be about 30, tall, dark hair braided into a complex plait, green eyes, unnaturally bright. She moved like someone accustomed to people parting before her. Druidesses. Timofey realized this before they spoke. He could sense them. Each of them carried manna within her. Not that tiny spark that smoldered in ordinary people. A full-fledged stream. Alive, green, connected to the earth. The eldest approached him. He was standing in a field, knee-deep in young lentil shoots. His hands were black with dirt. A rag bandage covered his head because the sun was unbearably hot. She looked at him, then at the field, then at him again, and she sank to her knees, right into the mud. The 4 behind her did the same. She called him Root. She said the sacred grove had been waiting for him for 300 years. She said he was the embodiment of the world tree. She said the grove's druidesses were dedicating themselves to his service. Timofey stood there. He looked at the 5 women kneeling in the mud before him, and he felt awkward, very awkward. He said he appreciated their visit, but they really should stand up because their knees were crushing the sprouts of the lentils he had just planted. The eldest looked up. She blinked. She looked down. Indeed, her knee was right on a young sprout. She jumped up in such horror as if she had stepped on a sacred relic. Liz, behind Timofey, was choking with laughter. The eldest druidess was named Serene. She didn't leave. Not on the first day, nor the second, nor the third. Her 4 companions had set up camp on the edge of the village and stood guard as if they were protecting a temple. Saren followed Timofey around like a shadow. She watched him work, how he touched the earth, how he closed his eyes and listened. She absorbed his every movement with an eagerness that made Timofey feel uneasy. She asked questions, but not the ones Liz asked. Liz asked how. Serene asked why. Why did he bring in manure when he could pour manna directly? Why wait for the seeds to sprout on their own when he could speed up growth in seconds? Why bother with wells when he could draw water with his power? Timofey gave the same answer over and over. Because the earth must learn to live on its own. If he did everything for it, it would remain crippled on his crutches. Take away the crutches, and it would collapse. The goal isn't to harvest a crop once. The goal is to set up a system that works without him. Saren listened. She nodded, and he could see she didn't understand. To her, he was the tree, the incarnation. He had to give, forever, endlessly, endlessly. The idea that a god must make himself unnecessary didn't fit into her worldview. On the second evening, she came to him as he sat by the fire. Liz was already asleep. Mira, too. The guard was snoring at the neighboring house. Saren sat down across from him, silently. The fire lit up her face. Beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, green eyes, but tired. For the first time, Timofey noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the fine crease at the corner of her mouth that people who live under constant stress develop. She spoke, quietly. She told him that the sacred grove was dying. For the last 50 years, the trees have been withering one by one. The druidesses sustained them with their manna, with their lives. Every druidess of the grove gave a part of herself every day so the grove might stand. They aged faster, they weakened faster, they die sooner. There used to be 30 of them, 12 remain. She said that when word reached the grove about a man who had grown a tree from dead stone, she didn't believe it. Then news came of the rye, of the wells, and she ran, literally. She ran for 2 days straight. Her 4 companions could barely keep up. She said that if he was who she thought he could save the grove. If not, she fell silent. Timofey waited. If not, in 10 years the grove would be gone, and without the grove, there would be no druidesses. And without the druidesses, the last patch of living earth in this part of the continent would die. Timofey looked at her, 27 years old, the senior druidess. She carried 12 lives and a dying forest on her shoulders. Since childhood, he had seen such eyes on farmers who had carried on the farm alone after their parents' deaths. The eyes of people who had no time to be afraid because others stood behind them. He asked how far the grove was. She replied, 3 days' journey to the east. He said he would finish with Rickhold first, then he would go. She nodded. And for the first time in 2 days, she relaxed her shoulders. Just a little, by a millimeter. Timofey noticed. For the next 5 days, he worked at double speed. Rickhold's fields were turning green. The horse barley stood waist-high and was filling out. The lentils were blooming with small white flowers. The green manure crops in the third field had risen into a solid green carpet. The villagers were working nearby. Not all of them. Not right away. But with each passing day, their numbers grew. Timofey demonstrated. He explained. He made them do it with their own hands. He didn't heal the land for them. He taught them to heal it themselves. A thin woman with intelligent eyes from the third row turned out to be a former herbalist. Her name was Gwen. She caught on faster than the others. Timofey made her the field supervisor. He taught her to determine soil acidity by taste. He taught her to make compost. He taught her to read the leaves to see what a plant was lacking. Gwen absorbed it all, and within 3 days she was already teaching others. Timofey watched this and felt a quiet joy. The system didn't need to be fed by him endlessly. He just needed to light the first fire. From there, people would pass it on to one another. On the 10th day after arriving in Recold, what he had been waiting for and fearing happened. He was working in the field with Liz. They were digging a compost pit for the next season. Mira sat on the boundary and sorted through seeds. Saren stood at a distance and watched. Timofey bent down to pick up a sack of manure, and the world swayed. Abruptly, as if someone had yanked the ground from under his feet. He fell to one knee. Hunger. Not the usual background hum he'd grown accustomed to. A blow. A wave. As if a hole had opened inside him and everything was starting to fall into it. Manna. He needed manna. Now. A lot. His body demanded it. It didn't ask. It demanded. He had been working for 10 days with almost no rest, pouring manna into the ground, into the wells, into the seeds. He was spending it, replenishing it from his meager surroundings, spending more than he was replenishing. The balance was broken, and now his body was taking its toll. Timofey felt the power pulling outward, without his permission. The grass around him began to wither, a circle, a meter in diameter, then 2. The spelt sprouts in the nearest bed turned yellow and drooped. Liz stood 3 meters away. She turned pale. She staggered. She clutched her chest. Mira cried out, softly, like a wounded bird. She could feel it. Timofey clenched his teeth. His fists tightened so that his nails dug into his palms. Blood. Pain. The pain helped. He seized the fleeing power and drove it back inside, like herding a beast into a cage, roughly, painfully, but precisely. The circle of dead grass stopped growing. Liz caught her breath. She turned pale, but she was on her feet. Mira sat on the ground and trembled. Serene ran toward him across the field. Timofey sat on the ground and breathed, slowly, deeply, controlling every breath. Hunger raged inside him like a rabid beast. He held it. After a minute, it let go. It didn't go away. It receded, like a wave receding from the shore. Timofey looked at the circle of dead grass around him, 2 meters in diameter, a perfect circle. Everything inside it had died. The grass, the insects, the worms in the soil. He had killed it all in seconds, without wanting to, without control, simply because his body wanted to eat. Liz approached, carefully, as if approaching a wounded beast. She asked what had happened. Timofey answered honestly. He said he had overused his manna, that his power drew from the living, that if he lost control, he would start drawing from everything around him, from plants, from animals, from people, that the line between a gardener and a locust was only his discipline, and that discipline had just cracked. Liz was silent. Mira was silent. Saren stood nearby, her face inscrutable. Timofey stood up, swayed, straightened himself. He said he needed a day off, one day, to eat, to sleep, to restore balance. He wasn't asking, he was stating a fact, because the alternative was worse. He went to an empty house on the edge of the village. He lay down on the floor and slept for 16 hours. He dreamed of roots, the same ones, huge, dead. But the heartbeat deep inside grew louder. He woke up to the smell of food. A tray stood on the floor next to him. Bread, cheese, boiled eggs, a pitcher of milk, a bowl of porridge, and an apple. Mira was sitting next to the tray. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the wall. But the tray was placed evenly, neatly. The food was arranged so that he could reach it without getting up. Timofey sat up. His body ached. His hunger rumbled. but more evenly. 16 hours of sleep hadn't quenched it, but they'd taken the edge off. He began to eat, silently. Mira was silent beside him. It was good. With Mira, the silence wasn't awkward. It was like the quiet in a garden. Natural. He ate everything, wiped his hands on his pants, and only then did Mira turn to him. She said one sentence. She said that yesterday, when he was losing control, she could feel it. Not fear, not pain. She could feel his hunger, as if the earth beneath her had for a second become his hunger. And the earth wasn't angry. The earth felt pity. Timofey looked at her. This 19-year-old girl who's afraid to talk to people had just told him what he couldn't put into words himself. The earth felt pity. It wasn't afraid. It felt pity. He stood up. He walked out of the house. It was early morning. The sun was just rising. The air smelled of moisture from the full wells, and of something else. Greenery. Timofey looked at the fields. The horse barley stood like a wall, golden, heavy, ready for harvest in a week. The lentils were blooming. The green manure crops were turning green. The circle of dead earth where he had lost control yesterday was clearly visible. A brown patch in the middle of the green field. Timofey walked over to it. He stood at the edge. The earth inside the circle was completely dead. He had killed everything in it. Not just the plants, the microflora, the fungi, the bacteria, everything the hunger had reached. He crouched down, placed his hand on the dead earth, and began to repair it. Slowly, carefully, giving exactly as much mana as needed, not a drop more. It was a lesson for himself. An hour later, the circle was overgrown. Thin young grass had pushed through the crust, not as thick as the surrounding grass, but alive. It needed time. Timofey stood up straight and saw that half the village was watching him. They stood at a distance, silently. There was a question in their eyes. Timofey didn't answer it. He turned and walked toward the village elder. Work wouldn't wait. He spent 4 more days in Recold, not in the fields. The fields were managing on their own. Gwen commanded like a general. The villagers listened. Timofey was busy with other things. He walked around the village's surroundings within a 5-kilometer radius. Every hill, every lowland, every ravine. He touched the ground. He read it. He drew a map, not on paper, in his head. A map of the soil, a map of the aquifers, a map of the mana reserves. And the farther he went from the village, the clearer the picture became. Vellastir wasn't just suffering from a lack of mana. Vellastir had been drained, systematically, professionally. Channels stretched underground at a depth of 10 to 30 meters. Not natural, artificial. Someone had laid a network of mana conduits beneath the entire kingdom. And through this network, the mana was flowing away. To the east, toward the border, beyond the border. Timofey stood on the hill and looked out over the barren plain. And he understood. Vellastir wasn't dying from drought. Vellastir was being bled dry. Like a donor, like livestock at a slaughterhouse, slowly, imperceptibly, generation after generation. Who? He knew the answer before he even asked the question. The Mana Guild. They weren't selling mana to Vellastir, they were selling him his own mana, pumped out from beneath his land, delivered back, for gold, for land, for freedom. Timofey clenched his fists, then unclenched them. Anger is a luxury, like panic. He couldn't afford it. But he remembered. He returned to the village and told the village elder. Not everything, just about the mana diggers. The elder listened. Nodded. Said that his grandfather had told him that in his youth, the land yielded 3 times as much. And his grandfather's grandfather had said that Vellastir used to be as green as malachite. Each generation is worse than the last. Now it's clear why. Timofey asked if the mana conduits could be blocked. The village elder looked at him as if he were crazy. He said the mana channels were the guild's property, that touching them meant declaring war. That the last time the Baron of Vellastir tried to block a channel on his lands, he died a week later. An accident, a very unfortunate one. Timofey nodded. Not now, but the information was stored away. he told Serene. She wasn't surprised. She said the druids had long suspected it. The earth had whispered to them about the channels. But they couldn't prove it. They couldn't see as clearly as he did. She asked what he was going to do. Timofey replied. He was going to build a system that would work despite the channels. If mana was being siphoned from below, he would create life that held on from above. A closed cycle. Plants feed the soil feeds the plants. Mycorrhiza binds everything into a single network. The mycelium retains moisture and mana, a living organism that doesn't depend on underground currents. It's hard, it's slower, but it can't be stolen, because you can't pump a forest through a pipe. Serene listened, and for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she asked the question Liz had asked. Not why. How? Timofey smiled. Progress. He said he'd show her, in the grove, when they got there. The last day in Recold. Timofey stood at the edge of the village. The rye was in ear. The wells were full. People were working in the fields. Gwen walked between the rows and gave orders. Everything was right. Everything's working. He turned to leave, and then someone called out to him, an old man. He was walking from the house at the edge, slowly, leaning on a stick. He was about 70, or 80, or 100. In a world where people age from hunger and despair, you can't guess a person's age. The old man approached. He looked up at Timofey and asked if he could ask for one thing. Timofey said he could. The old man led him behind the house. There was a garden, a dead one, 6 withered trees, bushes turned into gray skeletons. The ground between them was cracked and sunken. The old man stopped in the middle of this graveyard, and his voice trembled. He said it was his wife's garden. She had planted it when they got married, years ago. Roses. She loved roses, white ones, with pink edges. They smelled so good in the evening that the neighbors would come just to stand nearby. His wife died 8 years ago. The garden died soon after. 3 years, tree by tree, bush by bush. The old man watered them with water he carried in, hauled buckets 8 kilometers. It didn't help. The garden died. But he didn't uproot the dead trunks. Didn't clear the place. Left it as it was. Because it was the only thing left of her. Timofey stood and listened. He crouched down and touched the ground. He sensed it. Roses, yes. They had grown here. Their roots had left a mark in the soil. He could see the shape, the size, even the shade. The earth held the memory of what had grown there, like a photograph in the soil layers. White, with pink edges, large petals, a strong scent, sweet, with a hint of honey and something piney. Timofey closed his eyes and began. He didn't just revive the dead bushes, he grew new ones. From seeds that were still sleeping in the soil, the seeds of those very roses, sown by the wind and birds years ago. They had been waiting. He found them, awoke them, and guided them. Manna flowed precisely and gently, not in a stream, in drops, every drop in the right place. Each seed received exactly what it needed. Roots went down, stems up, thorns unfurled like little blades, leaves unfurled, glossy and dark, and buds. 1, 2, 5, 10. They opened slowly, white, with pink edges, large, and the scent, evening, honey, pine needles, that very one. The old man stood and watched. Then his legs gave way and he sat down on the ground, right among the roses. The stick fell from his hands. He reached out a trembling hand and touched a petal, and he wept, quietly, silently, just tears flowing down his wrinkles like water down a riverbed that had been empty for years. Timofey stood nearby. He said nothing. There was no need. The village had gathered behind the fence. They watched and understood. This man who had come from nowhere was not growing a crop. He is growing what was lost. He is growing memory. The road to the sacred grove led east. Timofey, Lizmira, Serene, and her 4 druidesses. The guards remained in Recold. The princess sent a note, a short one. She wrote that rumors about Recold had reached the capital. People are talking about green fields, about full wells, about roses in the old man's garden. She wrote that this is good, and that it is dangerous. The guild has heard as well. Timofey put the note away. It was dangerous, he knew that, but he couldn't stop. Just as he couldn't stop in the middle of the fields because someone was wagging a finger at him. 3 days' journey. The landscape changed. The dead plain gave way to hills. The earth here was different, not sucked dry to the bottom, exhausted but still clinging to life. Timofey could feel it through the soles of his boots, a faint pulse, residual mana, like a seriously ill patient who has little time left but is still breathing. On the second day of the journey, the road entered the forest, or what had once been a forest. Trees stood there, tall, old, but half of them were leafless, dry skeletons among the living. The bark on the dead trunks was cracked and hung in shreds. The living trees looked little better. The leaves were small, pale, the branches thin. Timofey stopped by one and pressed his palm against the trunk. The tree spoke, not with words, through sensations. Hunger, thirst, fatigue. It was drawing the last crumbs from the earth and not getting enough. The root system was working at its limit. The mycorrhiza was destroyed. The connection with neighboring trees was severed. Each tree was surviving on its own, and trees cannot survive on their own. A forest isn't a collection of trees. A forest is an organism. Remove the connections between the trees, and each one is doomed. On the third day they came out to the grove. Timofey realized they had arrived even before Serene said so. He sensed it. The air had changed. It had grown thicker, warmer, with a hint of something ancient. The mana here was different, not scattered like in a field, not dead like in Recold, alive, concentrated, but sick. The grove opened up around a bend in the path, and Timofey froze. Trees, huge. He had never seen anything like them in any lifetime. Trunks, 3 arms' widths thick. The crowns reached so high they were lost in the haze. The bark was silvery. The leaves were broad and dark. A mist hung between the trees, greenish, glowing. Mana. He saw the mana. It hung in the air like pollen, and it smelled. The same scent that was in the fruit. A storm. Wet bark. Spring. But beneath the beauty, beneath the silvery bark and the glowing mist, disease. Timofey approached the nearest tree. He placed both hands on the trunk and dove in, deep, like a diver into water. The tree let him in. He glided through its internal structure as if following a map. Bark, cambium, sapwood, heartwood, roots, and everywhere the same thing. Hunger. The tree was starving. It was connected to the soil and the soil fed it. But it wasn't enough. It was critically lacking. The tree drew mana from the earth and did not get what it needed. Like a person who eats but does not digest the food. Timofey dug deeper. Roots. He descended along them and found it. Mana conduits, the very same ones. Artificial channels underground, they ran beneath the grove. And drew from it, not as greedily as from the plains of Vellastir, more carefully, more subtly. Like a parasite that doesn't kill its host but feeds off it for years. The grove wasn't dying of disease. The grove was being milked. Timofey opened his eyes. Serene was standing nearby, waiting. He looked at her and said he knew why the grove was dying. It wasn't sick. It was being robbed. There were channels running underground that were drawing mana from it. Serene turned pale. So pale that the freckles on her nose became as distinct as dots on a map. She asked who. Timofey replied that the channels ran east, toward the guild. The same channels he'd found beneath Vellastir, the same system. Serene was silent, then she spoke. Her voice was steady, too steady. The voice of someone holding themselves back from screaming. She said that 12 druidesses were giving their lives to sustain the grove, every day, for years. They were growing old, weakening, dying. And all this time, their sacrifice had been going down the drain. They weren't feeding the grove. They were feeding the channels. Timofey nodded. It was cruel, but it was the truth. He said he could help. Not easily, not quickly, but he could. First, they needed to block the channels. Under the grove, only under the grove, without touching the ones that went further. Precisely, so as not to arouse suspicion right away. Then he needed to restore the mycorrhiza, connect the trees back into a single network, so they could share with one another instead of dying one by one. Then he needed to revitalize the soil, bring life back into it. The same principles as in Rickhold, only the scale was larger and the trees were older. It took him 4 days. He started with the channels. He found them underground using mana. 3 channels, thin, but deep. They pierced the rock like the roots of a dead tree. Timofey didn't break them. He made them thinner. He sealed the channels with roots, living roots that he had sprouted from the earth and directed toward the channels. The roots entwined the artificial veins and began to pull the mana back. Not to block it, to intercept it. The mana that had been flowing through the channels to the east now went into the roots and returned to the grove. It wasn't a blockage, it was a diversion, a parasite on a parasite. Serene watched. The druidesses helped. They couldn't do what he was doing, but they could support him. Their mana flowed into his work like water into a shared channel. Timofey could feel them. 12 streams, each one weak, but together they provided tangible support. He showed Serene every step, not like a god performing a miracle, like a teacher demonstrating a technique. Here is the channel. Here is the root. Here's how to guide the root to the channel. Here's how to secure it. She tried. She did it worse, rougher, but she managed. On the 3rd day of work, Saren did something she had never done in his presence. She sprouted the root herself, without his prompting. She found the channel. She guided the root. She entwined it. She intercepted the flow. Crooked, awkward, but on her own. Timofey looked at her. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands elbow-deep in mud, eyes closed, face focused. Not a trace of that exalted priestess who used to fall to her knees at the sight of him. She was working. He said she had just created life, all by herself, without waiting for a god, without praying. She did it, with her own hands. Saren opened her eyes. She looked at her hands in the mud, then at him, and her face, stern, solemn, the unapproachable face of the senior druidess. It flinched, for a second. She quickly turned away, but Timofey had seen it. She was smiling. On the 4th day, the grove came to life, not completely, but noticeably. The leaves darkened and swelled. Dead branches sprouted new shoots. The mist grew thicker and brighter. The ground between the trees warmed. Timofey stood in the center of the grove and felt the restored network at work. The trees were talking to each other again. Through their roots, through the mycelium, through the mana. The old tree on the western edge shared water with the young one on the eastern edge. The mycelium carried nutrients from the healthy trees to the sick ones. A system, alive, self-sustaining, just as he had promised. And then he heard it, not with his ears, with that new sense the fruit had given him. A voice, quiet, like the whisper of leaves, like the creak of old roots, but not a tree. Someone else. Someone deep down, beneath the ground, beneath the roots, beneath everything. The voice was calling. Not for him. The voice had been calling for a long time, 300 years. The voice was tired. The voice was lonely. And the voice was finally heard. Timofey stood motionless. The mana in his body stirred. The green lines on his arms flared brighter than ever. And from the earth, between the roots of the oldest tree, a glow rose. The glow rose from the earth slowly, like a sprout, like the first ray of slow through a crack in the rock. Green, warm, alive. Timofey stood and did not move. He felt the mana in his body respond to this light, resonating, like a tuning fork next to a note of the right frequency. The green lines on his hands burned so brightly that he could see them through the fabric of his shirt. The light gathered, condensed, and took shape. A girl, small, thin, barefoot, hair down to her heels, white as moonlight, skin translucent. Lines showed through her, the same ones on his hands. Green, branching, like the veins of a leaf. Eyes, huge, dark, without pupils, like two wells into which one could fall endlessly. She looked 20 years old, and 1,000 at the same time. The druidesses fell to their knees, all 4 of them, at once, as if cut down. Serene stood, her face turned as white as chalk, her lips moved silently. Liz took a step back. Mira didn't flinch. She looked at the girl of light with the expression one uses when looking at something familiar yet forgotten. The girl of light opened her mouth and spoke. The voice was strange. It didn't come from her throat. It came from everywhere, from the ground, from the trees, from the air, from the roots beneath her feet. She said one word, finally. Then she fell silent. Then she looked at Timofey, straight on, right in the eye, and he felt it. Recognition. She knew him. Not this version of him, not the ragamuffin in a stranger's body. She knew Timofey, the agronomist, the man who'd fallen asleep at the wheel thinking about roots. She was calling him. Timofey opened his mouth and found he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, not from fear, from something else, from the feeling that he was finally home, that it was all over. The road from the lab to the test field, from the field to the car into the darkness, from the darkness into a stranger's body, from the body to the feast, from the feast to the basement, from the basement to the square, from the square to the fields. The whole road led here, to this girl of light who had been waiting for him for 300 years. She took a step toward him, then another. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She hovered a centimeter above the surface. She came right up close. She raised her hand, slender, translucent, and she placed her palm on his chest. Cold, so deep that Timofey gasped, and at the same time, warmth. The two sensations overlapped, and his body couldn't decide whether he was freezing or burning. Mana surged into him, not from the girl, through the girl, from the roots, from the earth, from the entire grove at once, as if the ancient forest had gathered everything it had left and poured it into a single person. Timofey fell to his knees. The world expanded. He saw everything. The grove, every tree, every root, every strand of mycelium, every dormant microorganism. He saw beyond the grove, the forest, the fields, Rickhold, the capital, all of Vellastir, like a satellite image but alive, pulsating. He saw the mana conduits, the network, vast, spreading beneath the entire continent like the roots of a dead tree. And he saw where they originated. The center of the network was far to the east. Timofey didn't know the name, but he saw it. A city. Large, rich, standing where mana gushed forth, because all the channels from every direction carried mana there. The guild's capital, and more, deeper, beneath the entire network, beneath all the channels, beneath all the dead and living layers. He saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Roots, real ones, gigantic, as thick as a house. They entwined the entire continent. The world tree, dead, but not rotted, like a mummy, like the skeleton of a monster embedded in the rock. It was here, underfoot, under the feet of every person on this continent. And it wasn't just dead, it had been killed. Timofey saw the traces, like seeing the signs of disease in a cross-section of wood. Burns, not from fire, magical ones. Someone had burned the mana out of the tree, purposefully, layer by layer, ring by ring, like draining sap from a trunk, slowly, methodically. It wasn't a catastrophe, it was an operation, a surgical one that had lasted for years. And the one who did it, the one who killed the world tree, He used its roots as the foundation for a network of mana conduits. The dead roots became pipes. The living system turned into a water main. Timofey surfaced. The world collapsed back to the size of a grove. He was on his knees. The girl of light stood before him, and she wept, without tears. The light on her face trembled and flickered like a flame in the wind. She spoke 3 words. They killed my home. Timofey understood. Neri, the guardian spirit, the last fragment of the world tree, sleeping in the roots for 300 years. She had seen everything, remembered everything, and for 300 years she could not speak because there was no one to listen. He reached out his hand. She recoiled, like a frightened animal. Then she froze. Then she slowly returned and touched his fingers, cold and warmth. He spoke to her. 1 sentence. He said he would build her a new home. Neri looked at him. Dark eyes without pupils, bottomless. Something stirred within them. Something that had slept for 300 years and was afraid to wake up. Hope. Saren stood nearby, white as a wall. She saw the spirit of the grove, the very one to whom generations of druidesses had prayed, alive, real, weeping. And the spirit did not come to her, not to the elder druidess, not to the guardian, to him, to a stranger in a dirty shirt with dirt under his fingernails. Timofey stood up. His legs were shaking. Hunger was growling. The mana the grove had poured into him was already fading. His body was devouring it like a furnace devours wood. He looked at Serene, at the druidesses, at Liz, who stood with her mouth open, at me, who was quietly crying without knowing why, at Neri, who was suspended in the air and looking at him with a hope that made him want to run away. He said they needed to return to the capital. He said he now knew who had killed the tree. Not names, but the method and the system, and that the system was still in operation, and that those who created it were still in power, and that the only way to stop them was to build a new system, a living one that couldn't be killed without killing the entire world. He said that for this, he needed time, people, knowledge, and a princess who would cover for him while he worked. Neri flinched. She tensed. The light dimmed. She was afraid. 300 years of solitude had taught her to fear. Timofey looked at her and said she could go with them, if she wanted to. Neri blinked. She looked at the grove, at the trees that had been her home, at the ground where she had slept for 300 years. Then she looked at him and nodded. The light around her flickered, gathered, condensed, and Neri, the guardian spirit, the last fragment of the world tree, became solid, tangible, almost real. Her feet touched the ground. She shivered, looked at her bare feet, then at Timofey, and reached for the bag of food hanging from his shoulder. He handed her a flatbread. She took a bite, chewed, swallowed, and her face, ancient, sad, inhuman, melted into the smile of a child receiving the first piece of candy in her life. Liz, behind Timofey, said quietly that now their unit had a ghost who ate. Mira, next to her, laughed softly. The first time in front of Timofey. The return trip to the capital took 4 days instead of 3. Neri was slowing them down. Not because she was walking slowly, because she kept stopping, every 100 steps. She touched the trees. She stroked the bark. She pressed her cheek against the trunks. She whispered something in a language Timofey didn't understand. The trees responded. The leaves stirred in the complete stillness. The branches leaned toward her. The bark grew warm beneath her fingers. She was greeting them, every single tree. For 300 years she had slept in the roots, and now, for the first time, she saw what had become of the forest. Dead trunks, bare branches, brown earth. She didn't cry, but her glow dimmed with every dead tree, just a little, like a blown-out candle. Timofey didn't rush her. During breaks, Neri would sit down next to him, silently, Sometimes she'd pull food out of the bag with a bluntness that even Liz found striking. She ate everything: bread, cheese, dried meat, apples, nuts. The spirit of the world tree turned out to be as ravenous as a 10-year-old boy after a soccer game. Timofey didn't object. He understood. 300 years without a body, without taste, without smell, without touch. Every bite of bread was a revelation to her. On the second day of the journey, Neri spoke. For real. Not just single words, but in a coherent way. She told him she remembered how the tree died. Not all at once, gradually, year after year. Someone came at night, mages, powerful ones, in robes without insignia. They placed stones at the roots, black ones, smooth ones. The stones drew mana, from the roots into the stones, from the stones into the channels. She tried to resist. She screamed. She called for the druids. But by then, the druids could no longer hear her. The connection between the groves and the tree grew weaker with each passing year. Those who were killing the tree, the very same ones who were silencing the connection. She said there were 12 of them, 12 mages. They called themselves the Root Council. And they did not act out of malice, not out of hatred, out of conviction. They believed that the world tree made people weak, that free mana breeds laziness, that abundance destroys civilization, that only scarcity and competition drive the world forward. They killed the tree to create a market, a mana market, controlled, managed, with them at the top. Timofey listened. Liz listened. Mira pressed her hand to her mouth. Saren walked beside them, her face stony. Neri continued. She said that the Root Council hadn't disappeared. It had become the Mana Guild. 12 mages lived ordinary lives and died. But their children took their places, and their children's children. 300 years. One line, one system, one lie. That the tree had died on its own, that mana was finite, that without the guild, the world would perish. Timofey walked and thought. 12 families, 300 years, an entire world built on their lies. And him, one man, with the mana the fruit had given him, with knowledge from another world, with 3 girls, a druid, a spirit, and a princess somewhere in the capital. Against a system that killed a god and built an empire on his corpse. The scale of the problem was impressive. Timofey remembered how, as a grad student, he'd been given a plot of land behind a chemical plant. Dead. Poisoned. 5 square kilometers that everyone had written off as irreparable. He spent 3 years on it, and the plot blossomed. Not because he was a genius, because he didn't give up and took the next step. Always, every day, one step. They entered the capital in the evening. The city had changed in the 2 weeks they'd been gone. Timofey sensed it immediately. The air, the people, the energy. There were more guards on the streets. The gates checked everyone entering. They were let through at the druid's signal, but the guards watched them go. The princess met them at the palace. She wasn't alone. With her was a man whom Timofey recognized at first glance. Olvin Kassar, master of the Mana Guild. He stood next to Aaron and smiled. That same gentle, patient smile with which he had come to see Timofey in his cell. He congratulated Timofey on his successes in Rickhold. He said the guild was impressed. He said that perhaps they had started off on the wrong foot. He offered cooperation, genuine, open. The guild was ready to finance his work, to provide resources, mana, people, in exchange for one small thing: control. All the technologies he developed would become the property of the guild. All methods, all varieties, everything. The guild would distribute them as it saw fit, fairly, equally, as befits an organization that has been maintaining the balance of mana in the world for 300 years. Timofey listened and looked at Kassar. A gentle face, intelligent eyes, a gentle smile. He wasn't lying, not in the way that con artists lie. He believed what he was saying, believed that control was necessary, that free mana was dangerous, that only the guild could distribute resources correctly. Timofey remembered the mana conduits beneath Vellastir, beneath the grove, beneath the entire continent. He remembered the druidesses who died feeding the pipe. He remembered the old man with the dead garden. He remembered the children in Rickhold who stuck their hands in a bucket of water and laughed because, for the first time in their lives, the water wasn't imported, but their own. He looked at Kasser and said no, simply, without explanation. No. Kasser's expression didn't change. The smile remained. His eyes remained gentle. He nodded, said he understood, that the decision wasn't easy, that he wasn't rushing him, that the offer still stood. Then he turned to the princess and said one thing that changed everything. He said that the contract to supply mana to Vellastir was set to expire in 3 months. The guild would consider extending it, taking the new circumstances into account. He bowed and left. The silence in the hall was so thick that Timofey could hear Neri chewing an apple behind his back. The princess turned to him. Her face was calm. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her knuckles were white. She said he had just put the entire kingdom at risk. Timofey said he knew. She asked if he had a plan. Timofey said he did. 3 months. He needed 3 months to create a system that would supply Vellastir with mana without the guild. A living network, groves, fields, mycorrhiza, mycelium, a closed cycle, from the capital to the borders. The princess asked if it was possible. Timofey paused. Then he answered honestly that he didn't know, but he was going to try. The princess looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded and said 2 words. What are we waiting for? 3 months, 90 days. Timofey divided them into 3 phases. Phase 1, 30 days. Create hubs. 10 locations throughout Vellastir. Each location is a grove, not large, 20 to 30 trees, but with the right root architecture, with a mycorrhizal network, with a closed mana cycle. Each grove must become a generator, a small heart that pumps life into the surrounding land. Second phase, 30 days. Connect the hubs. Stretch living channels between the groves. Not mana conduits, roots, real ones, mycelium. A mycorrhizal network, an underground internet of fungi and roots through which trees communicate and share resources. What is called the wood wide web on Earth, only here with mana. Phase 3, 30 days. Launch. When the network closes, it will begin to pump mana on its own, without him, without the druidesses, without anyone at all. A living system that feeds itself and everything around it, like a real forest. Timofey laid out the plan to the princess. She listened. She calculated. She asked questions. How many people would be needed? How many resources? What distances? What risks? She thought like a commander before a campaign. Timofey assessed. He needs people at every location, not mages, ordinary people, who will tend the groves, water them, mulch them, watch over them. He needs the Sarian druids for support at key stages. He needs Liz and Mira to work with the soil and seeds. And he needs protection, because the guild won't just sit idly by. Erin nodded. She sent messengers to 10 villages across the kingdom. She assigned a guard detachment. She ordered the royal granaries to be opened. She did everything a ruler of a dying kingdom with nothing left but her will could do. Timofey began. The first location. A village 2 hours from the capital. He arrived in the morning and by evening had planted 20 trees. Not magical ones. Ordinary ash trees from seeds that Mira had gathered in the sacred grove. But he planted them correctly. The distance between the trunks, the depth of the roots, the direction of growth. Each tree stood where it was meant to stand, so that in a month the roots would intertwine and form a single underground network. Mana flowed from his hands into the ground. The trees grew before his eyes. In an hour, each one rose to twice a man's height. The roots spread deep and wide. Mycorrhiza unfurled from each trunk like a duck's web. Hunger was bursting to get out. Timofey held it back. Second point. Third. Fourth. He moved through Vellastir like a sower through a field. Web. Hunger burst outward. Timofey held it back. Second point. Third. Fourth. He moved through Vellastir like a sower through a field. Village after village, grove after grove. Liz rode with him. She prepared the soil. She mixed the compost. She argued about fertilizer ratios and was right twice. Mira followed behind, quiet, unobtrusive. But every seed that passed through her hands took root a day earlier. Timofey no longer hid it. He told her she had a gift, that the plants sensed her and reached out to her, that it wasn't a quirk, but a power. Mira listened. She was silent. Then she quietly asked why. Why her? Timofey replied that he didn't know why, but he knew why, so she could do what she does, grow. Mira lowered her eyes, but her shoulders straightened, by a millimeter. At the fifth stop, what he had been waiting for happened. At night. They set up camp on the edge of a newly planted grove. Timofey slept. Hunger slept. Everything slept. He woke up because Neri was trembling. She was lying next to him, curled up in a ball, and her glow was flickering. Quickly, erratically, like a light bulb before it burns out. She was whispering, "They're coming. They're coming. They're coming." Timofey jumped up. He put his hand on the ground. He reached out with manna, and he sensed them. People. 8 of them. Moving toward the camp from the east. Quickly. Quietly. Each of them has manna. A lot of manna. Not peasants. Mages. The guild. He woke the others. Liz jumped up instantly. Myra shuddered and pressed herself against her sister. Serene was already standing with her staff in her hands. Her druids lined up behind her. The guards drew their swords. Timofey told everyone to move behind the grove. He stayed behind. He stood before 20 young trees he had planted 6 hours ago. The roots hadn't intertwined yet. The trunks were still thin, vulnerable. 8 figures emerged from the darkness, in dark cloaks, their faces covered. Mana shimmered around them. One stepped forward. He removed his hood. Young, about 25, blonde hair, cold eyes. He introduced himself. Rain Kassar, the Magister's nephew. He said they had orders. Illegal mana plantations are to be destroyed. The guild's decision is final. Timofey looked at him. Young, self-assured, pumped full of mana like a wineskin, and with a sincere conviction in his right to destroy what does not belong to the guild. He recognized this type. A bureaucrat from a regulatory agency with an order in his pocket and a sense of self-importance in his eyes. Timofey didn't fight. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He did what he'd done his whole life whenever inspectors came to the experimental field. He showed results. He crouched down. He placed his hand on the ground at the roots of the nearest tree. And he grew it, right in front of them, out of nothing, out of dead dust. A grain, horse spelt, golden, earring, thick, in 30 seconds. Then he stood up, and he said that this was bread, food, life, that every grove he planted fed the village, that in 3 months Vellastir would stop buying mana from the guild, not because Timofey had defeated anyone, but because the land would learn to feed itself, and that rain could burn this grove, and the next one, and 10 more. But every grove burned was a village that would remain hungry, and those people would find out who burned it. Rain stood there. He looked at the sprouting spelt, then at Timofey, then at his men. 7 pairs of eyes looked at the grain growing from the dead earth. One of the mages lowered his hand, then a second. Rain gritted his teeth, turned around, and led his men into the darkness. He didn't touch a single tree. Timofey exhaled. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from mana overexertion. Hunger struck him so hard he staggered. Liz caught him by the arm. Mira clung to the other. Serene stood nearby, her face ashen. Neri sat under a tree, gnawing on a piece of bread. She was the only one who looked calm. Timofey said it was a reconnaissance mission. Kassar was testing the waters, checking the defenses. The real strike would come later, and it would be different. Not 8 mages in the night, something on a larger scale. They needed to hurry. 60 days had passed in a flash. Timofey had planted all 10 groves. He had connected them. The roots of the first groves had already intertwined and formed an underground network. The mycorrhiza had spread for kilometers. The mycelium carried manna from grove to grove like blood through arteries. The system was working. Still weak, still fragile, like a newborn organism that could die from a draft. But it worked. Timofey stood on a hill above the capital and felt the network. 10 points pulsing green. Threads between them, thin, alive, trembling. The earth around each grove came to life. A strip of green spread out from the trees like ripples on water. Village after village, field after field. Vellastir was changing color, from brown to green, in stripes, in patches, in islands. Not all of it yet, not everywhere yet, but already noticeable. People saw, and people spoke. Rumors spread through Vellastir like wildfire, of a man who grows life from dead earth, of bread that rises in 40 days, of wells that fill with water, of roses in the old man's garden. The rumors spread further, beyond the borders of Vellastir, to neighboring kingdoms, to trading cities, to the exchanges where manna was sold. The price of manna had fallen by 3% in a month. 3%. It sounds like little, but for a market that had been growing for 300 years, it was an earthquake. The guild reacted, not with mages in the night, on a larger scale, just as Timofey had predicted. Kasser declared an embargo. Vellastir was cut off from manna supplies. Completely, immediately. Not in 3 months. Now. The official reason: breach of contract, illegal manna manipulation, threat to the ecological balance. Fine words. The gist is simple: either surrender or die. The princess received the notice at noon. By evening, panic had broken out in the capital. Manna powered everything: water pumps, mills, forges, hospitals. Without manna, the city would die within a week. Without manna, the patients in the hospitals would start dying in 3 days. Without manna, winter supplies would rot without manna-powered refrigerators in 10 days. Aaron convened a council. Timofey was at the council. The advisors were shouting, demanding surrender, to accept Gildea's terms, to hand over the technology, to hand over Timofey, to give up everything just so the manna would flow back. Aaron was silent. Timofey was silent. When the advisors ran out of steam, the princess turned to him. A single glance was enough. Timofey stood up and said that the network wasn't ready yet. It would take a month. But in 3 days, he could supply the capital with manna. Not all of it, not as much as the guild used to provide, but enough. Enough for the hospitals, enough for the mills. The forges would have to operate at half capacity, but people wouldn't die. The princess asked how. Timofey answered. The groves. 10 groves throughout the kingdom. They're already pumping manna. Weekly, but they're pumping. He could speed up the process, boost the network, force the groves to give more than they're ready to give now. But it would be like revving the engine of a new car. It's possible, but risky and expensive. Expensive for him personally. The princess understood. She asked what it would cost. Timofey remained silent. She repeated the question. He answered. A year, maybe 2. Every great effort costs him a lifetime. To force the entire network, all at once, a month ahead of schedule. That's a year, at least. The hall fell silent. The advisors exchanged glances. Liz stood by the wall, biting her lip. Mira clasped Liz's hands and trembled. Saren stood as straight as a spear, her eyes ablaze. Neri sat on the windowsill and didn't eat. For the first time ever. She looked at Timofey, and her glow was dim. She knew. She remembered. The tree of me was also giving itself away, year after year, ring after ring, until there was nothing left. Aaron stood up. She walked over to him, close, closer than ever, and she spoke softly so that only he could hear. She said she had no right to ask this of him, that it was his life, that she would find another way. Timofey looked at her. 22 years old, a silver wedding band, eyes older than her face. The eyes of a man who, since childhood, has carried a country on his shoulders. A country that never once wept in his presence. Had never once asked for anything for herself. He replied quietly. He said that on his experimental field in his past life, there was a plot that everyone had written off. Celine, dead, useless. He toiled over it for 3 years, without funding, without support. His colleagues tapped their fingers against their temples, and then the plot yielded a harvest. And he understood one thing. If you know that the land can live, but you pretend it's dead because it's too expensive to heal, then you're not a scientist. You're an accountant. He turned around, left the hall, and went out into the field. Alone, at night. He stepped out onto that very royal field beyond the capital's walls. Dead. Vast. Stretching to the horizon. Empty. Beneath it, deep underground, ran the guild's mana conduits. The dead roots of the world tree, transformed into pipes. Timofey stood in the middle of the field. He took off his shoes. Bare feet on the dead earth. Cold, dust, stone. He sank to his knees. He placed both palms on the ground and closed his eyes. He reached out toward the network, toward the 10 groves, toward every tree he had planted, toward every root, toward every strand of mycelium. He called out, and the network responded. 10 green dots flashed in his mind. He pulled. Mana flowed. From the groves, through the roots, through the mycelium, across kilometers of living underground web. To him, through him, into the earth. Hunger howled, not a whisper, a roar. His body demanded to take everything, all the mana, all the people around him, all the groves, all life within a kilometer's radius. Timofey clenched his teeth. Blood trickled from his bitten lip. He held on. Mana flowed through him like a river through a dam. He did not take, he directed. Downward, into the dead earth, into the old channels of dried-up rivers, into the aquifers, into the roots of dead herbs, into the spores of dormant fungi. The earth drank, greedily, bottomlessly, like a man dying of thirst who had finally been given water. Timofey gave it away. He felt the mana leaving him, and with it something else was leaving. Time. Cells divided a little slower. Joints ached a little more. Somewhere at his temple, a pain flared up and died down. A year. He was giving away a year. The night dragged on. Timofey didn't count the hours. He counted the result. The earth was changing beneath his hands, coming to life, layer by layer. Billions of soil microorganisms were waking up. Mycelium was spreading out from his palms in all directions. The roots of dead grasses were sprouting new shoots. Moisture was rising from the depths. By dawn, a mist hung over the field. Not the morning kind. A different one. Warm, thick, green. The breath of the earth. The fog spread across the plain to the horizon. Beneath it, the earth blossomed. Grass, grasses, shrubs, young trees. In a single night, the dead desert had turned into a steppe, alive, green, real. Rivers. Timofey could feel water appearing in the old riverbeds. Not much. Little streams. But they were flowing. For the first time in 300 years. And right in the center of it all, right in front of him, a sprout was pushing up from the ground. Thick, powerful, silvery bark, broad leaves. It was growing, not like a sapling, like a volcano. The trunk thickened before his eyes. The branches spread wide. The crown unfurled like a tent. Within 10 minutes, a 3-arm-wide ash tree stood before Timofey. Young, but already mighty. The first sprout of a new network. The first node. The first step toward a new world tree. Timofey tried to stand up. His legs wouldn't. He fell. He lay down at the roots of the ash tree. Face up. The sky was growing lighter. The stars were fading. He raised his hand. Green lines on his skin barely glowed. His fingers trembled. The hair on his right temple was white. He couldn't see, but he could feel. A year. He had given a year. He was 31. He was 32. He didn't know how long he had lain at the roots, maybe an hour, maybe 2. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes, faces, 6 faces, above him. Aaron stood on the left, without a crown, her hair loose, her eyes were red. She wasn't crying, but she was close to it, closer than she'd ever been around him. Saren stood to the right, on her knees, hands in the ground. She was trying to channel mana into him. Timofey could feel its flow, warm, green, clumsy, but real. Liz was sitting at his feet, holding his ankle, for some reason, as if she were afraid he would float away. Mira was lying nearby, right on the ground, face down. Her arms were outstretched and her palms pressed into the soil. And from her palms, Timofey blinked. Mana was flowing from her palms. Weak, pale, but it was flowing. Mira was giving it away, not to him, to the earth around him. She was nourishing the grass, sustaining what he had grown, so it wouldn't die while he lay there. Timofey looked at her and thought that this girl, who hid behind her hair and was afraid of people, had just done what he had been teaching her for 2 weeks, all on her own, without a hint. Hader stood a little way off, with an axe. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the horizon, at the green plain that hadn't existed yesterday. Her face was wet. She didn't wipe away her tears. Maybe she didn't notice. Maybe she didn't want to notice. Neri was sitting on his chest, literally. Small, light, almost weightless. She pressed her ear to his heart and listened, the way one listens to a tree, the way one listens to the earth. Her glow was bright, brighter than ever. She had come to life along with the earth. Timofey sat down. Neri slid off him and squeaked indignantly. He looked around, and for the first time he saw what he had done. Greenery stretching to the horizon, grass, young trees, shrubs, a strip of life several kilometers wide, stretching from the walls of the capital to places he could no longer see. And an ash tree, a young giant, a trunk 3 arms wide, silver bark, a canopy like a tent. It hummed, quietly, steadily. Mana flowed through it like sap in spring. It was already pulsing, already working, a node in the network, a generator of life. People stood around the ash tree, hundreds of people. They had come from the capital, from the villages, from the nearest settlements. They stood and watched. The tree, the greenery, at the mist that hadn't yet cleared, at the man with graying temples who sat by the roots and squinted into the sun. Silence. Long. Then someone in the crowd dropped to his knees, followed by a second, a third, a 10th. Timofey saw a wave moving through the crowd. People were falling to their knees one after another, like ears of grain in the wind. He remembered Serene, the druidess, kneeling, worship. No. He tried to stand up. His legs buckled. Serene caught him on one side, Liz on the other. He straightened up and said, loudly, so that everyone could hear. He said there was no need to kneel. He said that what they were seeing was not a miracle. It was work. His work. And their work. Because every grove he had planted needed people to tend to it, to water it, to mulch it, to watch over it, to protect it. He said the earth was not cursed. The earth is sick, and it can be healed. But it is not God who heals it. It is hands, knowledge, patience. He said that the horsetail grass ripens in 40 days, and that the seeds would be distributed today to everyone who was ready to work. The crowd listened. People rose from their knees, slowly. Not everyone, but many. And in their eyes was something Timofey hadn't seen before. Not worship, not fear, not even hope. Something simpler. They wanted to work. They wanted to do what he had shown them, with their own hands, on their own land, for their children. Timofey looked at Liz. She was standing nearby, her eyes shining. She said quietly that they wouldn't have enough seeds for everyone. Timofey replied that there would be enough. 1 plot yields 10. 10 yield 100. In 2 harvests, all of Vellastir would be planted. The math was simple. She smiled, crookedly. She sniffed, and turned away so he wouldn't see her wipe her eyes. Hader approached, for the first time, of her own free will. She didn't kneel. She didn't bow. She looked him straight in the eye. Her eyes were red. Her face was hard. She said one thing. She said that 3 years ago her brother had died on the southern border. The outpost, the drought, the wells had dried up. Help never came. He was the youngest in the garrison, 20 years old. She said she'd hated the gods since then, all of them, any of them, because none of them came. She paused. Then she said that he wasn't a god either, but he had come, and that was enough. She turned and walked away. Timofey watched her go. Then he turned to Aaron. The princess stood nearby, quiet, pale. She held something out to him, an apple, green, from the tree he'd grown in the courtyard, that very small garden he'd planted for her, under her window, so the queen would have one place where she wasn't the queen. He hadn't known the tree was already bearing fruit. Only 2 months had passed. But Manhwa sped everything up. He took the apple, took a bite. Sour, green, not perfect. The first harvest is always sour, but real. Aaron said quietly, "Eat. You've earned it." He chewed the apple and looked out at the green plain, at the people, at the ash tree, at the 6 women beside him. Each carried her own pain. To each he had given something, not because he was a god, because he knew how to listen. To the earth, to people, to the silence between words. Neri crept up from the side and stole the apple right out of his hand. Took a bite, winced, sour. But she didn't give it back. Timofey didn't take it from her. 3 days. It took 3 days to organize the distribution of seeds and assign people to the groves. Aaron worked 20 hours a day. Messengers scurried all over Vellastir. Gwen from Rickhold arrived and took charge of training the new caretakers. Liz compiled a guide to grove maintenance, 30 pages. Mira drew illustrations for it. Serene and the druidesses scattered across the network's nodes to sustain the groves with mana while they gathered strength. Timofey lay at the roots of an ash tree recovering. The hunger had subsided. It hadn't disappeared, but it had subsided. The network was working. 10 groves plus the ash tree in the center, 11 nodes. They drew mana from the soil, from the air, from the rain, from the sunlight. They processed it. They distributed it. They nourished the land around them. Vellastir was turning green, slowly, but unstoppably. The guild's embargo wasn't working. Not entirely. The capital was struggling. The forges were operating at half capacity. The Magotech refrigerators had stopped, and they had to salt the meat the old-fashioned way. But the infirmaries were working. The mills turned. People did not die. And every day the green strip on the map of Vellastir grew wider. On the 10th day after the night in the field, Timofey got up. On the 12th, he left the capital. On the 14th, he reached the southern border, that very one, where Brother Hader had died. The outpost stood empty. The walls were cracked. The well was blocked with stones. The ground around it was dead, not a blade of grass. Timofey stood in the midst of this desolation. Kater stood beside him, silently. He hadn't asked her to come. She had come on her own. Timofey dropped to one knee. He placed his hands on the ground and began. Without haste, without forcing it. Carefully, like planting a tree on a grave. He grew it from a seed he found in the soil, an old one, asleep, waiting. The tree rose slowly, not in minutes, in an hour. Not tall, sturdy, with deep roots and a broad crown. It bloomed, white. Timofey stood up and told Hader that this tree would bear fruit even in the driest year. He had bred it specifically, drought-resistant to the extreme, roots reaching the water table. It would survive here. Hader looked at the tree, at the white flowers, at the sturdy trunk. Then she looked at the ground by the roots, where, 3 years ago, a 20-year-old boy had died, one she hadn't been able to save. She didn't cry. She placed her hand on the trunk. She closed her eyes. She stood there like that. A minute. 2. Then she took her hand away. opened her eyes, turned to Timofey, and for the first time ever, she called him by name. Not root, not magician, not ragamuffin, by name. She said thank you. Timofey nodded. They returned to the capital 3 days later. The network was gaining strength. The groves were growing. The roots were intertwining. The mycelium was spreading farther and farther. Mana flowed through the living channels with ever-increasing power. Vellastir was coming back to life. Not in a day, not in a week, but unstoppably. Like spring. Kasser sent a letter, a short one. He wrote that he was impressed, that he had underestimated it, that he was ready for negotiations. On his terms, of course. Timofey didn't reply. He was busy. He was sitting in the palace garden, that very one, where he had started with manure and a shovel. The garden was in bloom. The trees rustled with leaves. The rows of crops were sprouting. The earth smelled of rain. Liz sat nearby, arguing with Mira about which variety of medicinal root to name next. Mira quietly insisted on her own way and, for the first time, wouldn't back down. Serene sat a distance, grafting a cutting from a young ash tree. By herself. Without his help. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. She no longer waited for God. She worked. Hadar stood by the gate, with an axe, keeping watch. Not for enemies, out of habit. But Timofey noticed that she had brought a pot of soil and planted something. Small, green. He didn't ask. Neri was lying on an ash tree branch in the palace garden, dangling her legs and eating a pear, her fourth in an hour. She was humming something, a melody 300 years old, quiet, warm, like the rustling of leaves. Aaron came in the evening, alone, without advisors, without guards. She sat down next to Timofey on the garden bed, right on the ground, in a dress that cost more than all of Rickhold's harvest. She said the network was working, that in the last week, not a single person in Vellastir had died of starvation. For the first time in 5 years. She said that 3 villages in the south had sent their first harvest of horse barley to the capital, voluntarily, simply because they had a surplus, for the first time in 5 years. She paused. Then she said that the guild would not back down, that Kasser would regroup, that the war for mana was only just beginning, that other kingdoms would demand the same thing Vellastir had received, that everyone would want Timofey, as a weapon, as a resource, as a god. Timofey listened. She was right. Vellastir was the beginning, the first step. It would be followed by a second, a third, a 10th. He looked at the ash tree in the center of the garden, young, strong, growing. This ash tree is connected to the network, to the groves, to the earth. In a year, its roots will reach the borders of Vellastir. In 2, to the neighboring kingdoms. In 5, in 10. A new tree, not an idol, not a god, a network, living, self-sustaining, one that needs no gardener, one that feeds itself. He looked at Aaron, at the thin silver band in her hair, at her hands, which for the first time since he'd known her lay calmly on her lap, not clenched into fists, not clenched until her knuckles turned white, just hands, alive, warm. She was coming to life, too, like the earth, slowly, but unstoppably. Timofey leaned back, lay down on his back on the warm garden bed. The earth was warm. It smelled of life. Neri threw a pear core from a branch at him. It hit him in the forehead. Liz burst out laughing. Mira giggled and hid her face in her palm. Hader, standing by the gate, twitched the corner of her mouth. Maybe. Saren shook her head, but Timofey saw her hide a smile behind her hand. Aaron, standing next to him, exhaled quietly, long and deep, like someone who hadn't breathed deeply in a very long time. Timofey lay on the garden bed and thought. Ahead lay war with the guild. Ahead lay the secret of the 12 families. Ahead lay the new tree that needed to be grown from a sprout into a global network. Ahead lay years of work. But right now, right now, the earth is warm, the sky is clear, Nearby are the people who need him, and whom he needs. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in this world, he didn't think about what needed to be done tomorrow, but about how good he felt right now. Agronomist and plant breeder, candidate of sciences, a gardener on a global scale. Timofey fell asleep in a warm garden bed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just as befits the great god tree for whom they had waited 300 years.